Welcome, everyone, to our Thursday night session of Bible study and through the revelatory understanding of divine principle. And I'm so happy that you decide to join us tonight. This is the American Clergy Leaders Alliance. And the theme of what we're doing is we want to bring absolute true love ethics into our families and communities and nation as a way to really transform our nation during this troublesome time. Tonight, we're very excited that we have our guest presenter, Pastor Alan Feldsott, who will be presenting part 2 on what we call the true origin of evil. And as we know, most of our members and associates and supporters were very excited that Roe versus Wade was finally overturned. So the decision of America to legalize and promote the tragedy of murdering babies could be overturned. And although the reality is it's just going to state rights, so each state can make their decision. But at least as a nation, we're not confirming that tragic decision. And what we really need to stop is unwanted pregnancy. And we have to restore this absolute true love ethics into our families and communities. So with that said, I'd like to just introduce our speaker, Pastor Alan Feldstott, who has a long career of Bible study and presentations and teaching. He's a great educator. And with that said, I'd like to just turn it over to Alan and let you get started.
All right. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
See you. I know most of you are muted, so I can't hear you. That's a good introduction especially for what we're going to be talking about tonight. You know, and as David said, a lot of the problem, especially with Roe v. Wade, actually, the majority of the issue has to do with unwanted pregnancies, and how does that even happen in this world that God originally created? So we're going to take a look at this and go in more deeply into the fall of man. So can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
Okay. Great.
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay. So, today we're continuing this series of presentations, which we call the Divine Principle Bible Study. And this is part 2 of the chapter called The Fall of Man. And this is about man's separation from God. So, even though we're studying the fall of man, I always feel like whatever we're studying, it's important for us to go back and be reminded of what God's original plan was for his children when he created the world, because that's really the beginning point. And in fact, that is also the end point, as we talked about in the principle of creation. So as a God of goodness and love, God did not create the world to be a world of suffering, right? We can't imagine that God would purposely create the world in order for his children to suffer. He created it to be heaven on earth, which is the fulfillment of the 3 blessings. As Genesis 1:28 said, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And as Jesus spoke in the Lord's Prayer, human beings were meant to have dwelled with God in the kingdom on the earth, and then continue to live forever with God in the kingdom of heaven in the spiritual world. So he told us all to pray for God's kingdom to come on earth. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He didn't say, just wait till you die and you'll go to heaven. He said, pray for God's kingdom to be established on the earth. So in our previous presentation, part 1 of the fall, we studied the biblical account of the falls recorded in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis. So in the same way that Jesus often spoke using symbols and parables, we can see that many aspects of the story of the fall were also symbolic. And we talked pretty specifically and thoroughly last time about what those symbols were. So what exactly is the root of sin, which has plagued mankind from the beginning of history? So let's just quickly review those symbolic elements and what we found in our previous discussion. So from the principle of creation, we learned, first of all, that God does not create human beings in a mature, perfected state. We must go through a growing period, during which we must remain obedient to God. And had Adam fulfilled his portion of responsibility by keeping the commandment, he would have become, first of all, a true son of God. He would have become a true husband to Eve, and he would have been a true father to his children. And this would have been the root of the sinless lineage of mankind. So we concluded that the tree of the life symbolizes true man, perfected Adam, a man who has fully realized the ideal of creation. And Jesus compared himself to being like a vine, a true vine. He said in John 15:5, I am the vine and you are the branches. And then the second tree named in the story is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we concluded that this tree represents none other than the other person in the garden, who is the woman Eve. So the two trees represent the two people. The serpent tempted Eve to eat the fruit of the tree, and then Eve offered the fruit of the same tree to Adam. So in other words, this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was involved in the sin between the serpent and Eve. That's when the serpent tempted Eve to eat the fruit. But it was also involved in the sin between Eve and Adam, when Eve tempted Adam to eat the fruit. So what's the common denominator in those two sins? It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and Eve herself was that common denominator. Then who or what was the serpent? The serpent represents the archangel Lucifer. Lucifer was originally with God in heaven, but was thrown down when he rebelled against God, deceiving God's children and causing them to act against God's commandment. We read in Revelation 12:9, so the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast down with him. So now that we've identified the key elements of the story of the fall, we need to go deeper into understanding what actually was the sin that was committed in the garden, and also understanding how and why it took place. So once again, in order to understand that, the Bible gives us insights into the true nature of the original sin. So we talked about Lucifer being an archangel or a leader of other angels. And when you think about angels, people think about angels, the glorious angels on high, right? We think they're high in heaven, they're pure, they're messengers of God. However, if we look at the Bible, we find a little bit different understanding of what is going on with the angels. That some of the angels were actually involved in very, very serious sins. So what kind of sins did the angels commit? In the book of Jude, verses 6 and 7, it says, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So this tells us that there were angels who, like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, committed sexual sin. So let's look at this further. So let's compare the sin that's described in the book of Luke to the sin of the archangel Lucifer and to human beings in the garden. So in Genesis 3, 6 and 7, it says, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave it to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. So here's talking about the sin of the human beings. So what changed after human beings committed the sin of eating the fruit. Something changed, right? Something was different. So before the fall, Genesis 2:25, it says that this man and the woman were naked and unashamed. So there was no sense of shame or guilt or anything, and they were naked. But after the fall, Genesis 3:7 says, the eyes of both were open and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. So they covered their lower parts with these fig leaves. It says that they suddenly knew that they were naked. Does that literally mean that they didn't know that they didn't have any clothes on before? But somehow what really happened is that they became ashamed. They felt guilty about their lower parts. So why would they suddenly feel shame about their sexual parts? So if Adam and Eve had committed a sin by eating a literal fruit, they would have naturally been covering up their mouth or hiding their hands behind their back. That's how we would normally react, right? If we had committed some kind of sin with our hands or with our mouth. But they didn't do that. So since Adam and Eve hid their lower parts in shame, we can infer that the sin that they committed in the Garden of Eden, which caused their conscience to be stricken, was committed with those parts that they hid, their lower parts, their sexual parts. So we know that God created man to be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion over all things, and those are actually godly things. Everything that God created, of course, is godly and pure and wonderful. In order to multiply, God gave human beings sexual parts and the ability to experience and enjoy sexual love as a mature and committed husband and wife. Therefore, the sexual love between a husband and wife was created to be an expression of God's own love and goodness. In fact, it would be a representation of the fulfillment of the second blessing that God gave to man in the beginning. So that sexual relationship between man and woman should have been a wonderful thing without any sense of shame or guilt associated with it. But when human beings act in accordance with God's will and principles, they naturally feel God's love and have no sense of shame or guilt. On the other hand, God designed human beings with a conscience that directs us to follow God and produces a feeling of shame or guilt if we go against him. Right? So even in our conscience, even if we begin to deviate or attempt it to be moved away from God's will, we are created to have some kind of alarm go off through our conscience so that we don't fall into a wrong situation. So the fruit itself signifies the love of Eve. So the fruit of the tree appears when the tree begins to mature. And when the fruit is ripe, it's delicious to eat. It also contains the seeds for what? The seeds are used for reproduction. Eve's eating of the fruit after being tempted by Lucifer denotes that against the word of God, she consummated an unprincipled love relationship with the angel. She then entered into an illicit relationship with the man, Adam, and subsequently gave birth to sinful children, passing on the seed of what? Not God's seed, but the seed of original sin. So Adam's role was to become the perfected image of God on earth, passing on the seed of God as the beginning of God's own blood lineage. However, instead of becoming the image and the body of God, he fell away from God and corrupted his seed with Satan's evil nature. That original sinful nature was passed on from generation to generation. We read Jesus' words in John 8:44, "You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." So when he could see that evil nature, that sinful nature of man come out, where does that come from? That comes from the father, the devil. So what other biblical evidence do we see showing the real meaning of the tree of knowledge? So Genesis 4:1 says, "Now Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord." So this expression that Adam knew his wife and she conceived doesn't mean that they got acquainted with each other or they just talked to each other. So this means, how does she conceive? Is through having a sexual relationship. So many times the Bible uses this term, to know or knowledge, meaning to have a sexual relationship. Genesis 19:4 and 5 says, "But before they lay down, The men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." So the fallen, sexually immoral men of Sodom did not want to have a conversation with the angels in Lot's house, who they called men. They wanted to have sex with them. So these are additional examples of how the word knowledge, or the word to know, the verb to know, is used to describe sexual relationships in the Bible. And then we read in the book of Solomon where he compares his lover to a tree with fruit. Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verses 6-9. "How beautiful and pleasant you are, O loved one, with all your delights. Your stature is like a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I say, I will climb the palm tree and lay hold of its fruit. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the scent of your breath like apples, and your mouth like the best wine." So in the Bible, we find references to the fruit as symbolic of a woman's sexual part. So although this kind of understanding may be new to many people, we actually find evidence of the effects of the fall all around us, from TV shows that are about seduction, like this TV show called Lucifer, to stores selling sexual products, even stores where they might be named Adam and Eve. It is clear that God's original ideal for the relationship between man and woman was defiled by the first human ancestors. Therefore, the root of sin was the illicit sexual relationship that God's daughter Eve had with the archangel Lucifer, followed by the premature and illicit sexual relationship Adam had with the fallen Eve. So even if Lucifer had tempted Eve and she gave in to that temptation, if Adam had resisted and rejected that temptation from Eve, God could have continued to work through Adam. Things may have been very different. However, Adam succumbed to Eve's temptation as well. So they could not multiply God's good, pure lineage, but instead they multiplied Satan's evil lineage. And this also explains why, as Christians understand, all human beings descending from Adam and Eve are born into sin and are in need of salvation. So the fact that Adam and Eve's descendants are born with sin, this could not have been part of God's original plan or ideal. Do you think that God actually planned for evil to happen and for sin to take place and planned for Adam and Eve to disobey him? Instead, this sinful nature came about as a result of man's disobedience to God's commandment, leading to the change of blood lineage from God's to Satan's. So let's take a closer look at the motivation and process of the fall. So God's desire, first of all, was to create a world where his children could live in his kingdom on earth and in heaven for eternity. What could have driven the archangel, Eve and Adam, to sin against God? What was the process that could lead God's own creations to rebel against him? So to truly understand the fall, since it was initiated by the archangel Lucifer, we need to understand more about angels and their mission. Like all beings, angels were created by God. God created these spiritual beings prior to any other creation. So the angels already existed before God created man. And angels were created in the position of servants, not as God's children. So who were God's children? Adam and Eve, created in the image of God, right? The image of God means his children. Angels were not created in that position. God created angels to assist him in creating and sustaining the universe. In the biblical account of the creation of heaven and earth, after God had created the angels, we find that God spoke in the plural. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. This is Genesis 1:26. So in the Bible, we find many instances of angels working for the will of God. Usually the angels appear like men. So first of all, the angels conveyed to Abraham important words of God's blessing in Genesis chapter 18. Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. So it is commonly understood that these men that appeared were actually angels delivering a message from God. And in Matthew chapter 1, we read where the angel heralded the conception of Christ. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary, your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save the people from their sins. And in the book of Acts, we read about how an angel actually helped Peter escape from prison. And this is in chapter 12. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone in the prison, and he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, Arise quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. Then the angel said to him, Gird yourself and tie on your sandals. And so he did. And he said to him, Put on your garment and follow me. So he went out and followed him, and did not know what was done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. When they were past the first and second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened to them of its own accord. And they went out and went down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. Beautiful story. So rather than being depicted as being in a really high position, much higher than much higher than human beings, angels are depicted as servants to human beings who are God's children. So the angel who escorts John in the book of Revelation calls himself a servant. I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I had heard and seen them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who had been showing them to me. But he said to me, Don't do that. I am a fellow servant with you and with your fellow prophets and with all who keep the words of this scroll. Worship God. So in Hebrews, the angels are referred to as ministering spirits. Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be the heirs of salvation, to minister to human beings, to men and women? And in the book of Corinthians, Paul tells us that we, as human beings, are meant to judge the angels. As God's children, we are meant to judge the angels. Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more than matters pertaining to this life? So we may have to rethink a little bit our understanding of angels and the human beings' relationship to them. So this diagram illustrates the true nature of the relationship between angels and human beings. Even though angels were created first, they were created to be servants and ministering spirits to human beings. Human beings are actually the only beings in creation who are created in God's image, who have dominion over the earth and all the creation, as we studied in the chapter on creation, the purpose of creation. So if you think about it, any other type of being that the Bible refers to as being created in God's image? No, it's only human beings. Then what is the position of the angels? What is their relationship? So God is the father to Adam and Eve, as well as the master of all creation. So God is also the master of the angels. So although we think of angels as being in the higher position, they are really in the position of ministering spirits or servants. And only God's children are from his own lineage, created in his own image. So angels are not created as God's children. They are part of the creation, and man was meant to have dominion over them. And that is why we are even meant to judge the angels. And Genesis 1:27, again, is where it tells us that God created man in his image. So why do we have this kind of concept of angels being greater than us? It's only due to the fall, when human beings lost their original position as true sons and daughters of God. Right? If we had maintained our true position as God's true sons and daughters, we would have understood and looked at the angels as these wonderful creations of God who were made to be servants and ministering spirits. So what was the relationship between God, Lucifer, and Adam and Eve before the fall took place? Lucifer as the archangel appointed by God, was the channel of God's love to the angelic world. The archangel means the top angel. So he virtually monopolized the love of God. And then Lucifer, as this being of light, Lucifer, right, would pass on, let me go back, would pass this God's love, to the rest of the angels. However, after God created human beings as his children, he naturally loved them many times more than he ever loved Lucifer, who he had created as a servant. So you can think about, in a king's palace, a king will love his own children, the princes and princesses that come from his own lineage in a different way than he would love those who are in the position of servants in the palace. So how did Lucifer feel when he saw God loving his own children created in the image of God? So when Lucifer saw that God loved Adam and Eve more than him, he felt as if there had been a decrease in the love he received from God, even though he was receiving the same amount of love as he did before. So again, God created the angels first. So among all the things of creation, actually the angels were the highest being in the creation, and Lucifer was on top of the angels. So he felt like he was receiving the most love from God. Then when Adam and Eve, as God's children, came, God could love them more. So he felt from a relative position that he was receiving less. And this situation is similar to the biblical parable of the laborers in the vineyard in Matthew 21-16. Although the laborers who had worked since morning received a fair wage, when they saw that those who came later and worked less received just as much, they felt underpaid, right? They complained, they were jealous about it. So in a similar way, Lucifer felt like God was cheating him, or God was not treating him fairly. So he was jealous. So rather than maintaining his heart of humility and love before God, sincerely dedicating himself to God's will, Lucifer left his position as God's servant. Lucifer, feeling as though he were receiving less love than he deserved, wanted to hold the same central position in human society as he enjoyed in the angelic world, as the channel of God's love. So out of jealousy towards Adam and Eve, he seduced them and dominated them, separating them from God. So had Lucifer unconditionally served Adam and Eve, who were in the position of God's children, and maintained his own servant position, he would have received even more of God's love than he did before. However, he acted out of jealousy, separating them all from God. So even the angels were meant ultimately to be most fulfilled, to experience the most love by receiving love from God's true son and daughter. That's how it was meant to work. So let's take a closer look at the order of events which comprise the fall of man. First, the archangel Lucifer tempted Eve to eat the fruit, right? As we read in chapter 3 of Genesis. So Eve should have remembered God's word and obeyed the word, no matter how much Lucifer may have tempted her. So Lucifer could not force Eve to fall. However, God created his children with free will and responsibility. So it was Eve's responsibility to keep the commandment. So did Lucifer force Eve to fall? No. He tempted her. He tried to convince her, but it was her responsibility, and it was based on her free will that she actually chose to disobey God and to listen to Lucifer's temptation. So she gave in and she ate the fruit. And this fallen and unprincipled action which took place through the sexual relationship between the angel and Eve is called the spiritual fall, since Lucifer is only a spiritual being. So in a sexual relationship between two human beings, of course, the sexual give and take happens between both physical and the spiritual substantial selves. But in the relationship between the archangel and Eve, between a spiritual being and Eve, it happened between just their spiritual selves. So this is called the spiritual fall. So how is it even possible for this fall to occur, the sexual relationship to occur between Lucifer, who was an angel, and Eve, who was a human being? So in the Bible, we can find many stories of encounters of a very substantial nature between angels who are spiritual beings and human beings. So in the book of Genesis, chapter 32, we have the account of an angel who wrestled with Jacob and put his thigh out of joint. So the spiritual being wrestled with Jacob, who's a physical being. In the book of Genesis, 3 angels visited Abraham's family and even ate a meal of veal, milk, and curds. That sounds pretty substantial to me too, right? And 2 angels visited Lot's house and ate the unleavened bread he served them. So then there was the second act of the fall, the second part. When Eve tempted Adam, he gave in to that temptation and they engaged in a sexual relationship. And as mentioned earlier, that relationship between 2 human beings was both spiritual and physical sexual relationships, since each one of them has a spiritual self and a physical self. So that give and take was not just between their spirits or not just between their bodies, but it was the interaction of both. We call that the physical fall because it involved the physical body as well. So how did the fall affect Adam and Eve's relationship with God? So when Lucifer tempted Eve into committing an illicit sexual relationship with him, an unprincipled love relationship, both of them were immediately cut off from the love of God. So God is an absolute God. He cannot fully relate to anything or anyone that goes against his principles. So even Lucifer both acted in a very unprincipled and self-centered and evil way. God could not relate to that. They were cut off from God, and they felt shame and guilt in front of God, especially Eve. So having gone against the word of God and her own conscience, she felt guilt and shame. And feeling that shame, she immediately wanted to resolve that issue. She thought, how can I restore the innocence, the purity that I had before I got into this relationship with Lucifer? So you can think about, sometimes even in our world today, if people get seduced or raped or something, they even feel like killing themselves. But so Eve wanted to get out of this horrible feeling, and she thought, well, Adam was really meant to be my husband. Maybe if I go to Adam, that will make things right. So fallen Eve then did what? She seduced Adam with the hope that by uniting with him, who she knew was originally to be her husband, she could rid herself of her fear and guilt and once again receive the love of God. This was Eve's motivation, which led to the physical fall. So going against the commandment from God, Adam responded to Eve's temptation by coming together in an illicit spiritual and physical relationship of sexual love. So this caused God's son, Adam, also to be separated from God and then put under Satan's dominion. So who did they obey? They didn't obey God, they obeyed Satan or Lucifer. So God, who is our loving parent, our parent of love, who had such beautiful hopes and dreams for his children and for this world, he had to watch as Adam and Eve came to be dominated by the fallen archangel, Lucifer. So God lost his own children, and his lineage became corrupted with Satan's sinful seed. It's unimaginable how much pain and suffering the fall brought to God. So if God is a perfect God, how is it really possible for something to happen that was not his will? So he told them what was his will, right? He told Adam and Eve, do not eat the fruit. That was his will. So how is it possible that things can happen in this world that are not God's will? As we learned in the principles of creation, human beings are not created or born mature. Man was given freedom and responsibility in order to co-create himself and to stand in the position of the Lord of creation. God intended that during the growing period, Adam and Eve would remain pure and relate to each other as what? As brother and sister. So until they reached maturity and could then be blessed by God, they should relate in a pure way, like they were brother and sister. Because human beings have free will, it's possible that during the growing period, before they reach maturity, they can choose to disobey God. Right? An immature person who is not 100% one with God can go against God. So God gave them the commandment for what reason? Did God give them the commandment to test them or to punish them? No, he gave them the commandment to protect them so that they could become fruitful and mature in godly love. And if they had, God would have blessed them in marriage, fulfilling his second blessing to them. And at that point, Adam and Eve would relate as husband and wife, experiencing the joy of pure, God-centered sexual love. So then how was it possible for the fall to take place? God, again, could not interfere with the actions of human beings since he had given them free will. So God gave them free will and he gave them the commandment. So if he saw them about to commit sin and then he interfered with that, he would be going against his own plan of creation. He would be going against his own principle of creation. So human beings, as a result of the fall, they fell into an unprincipled state apart from God. So this realm that they fell into was even below the formation stage. So this level of darkness was an unprincipled state of being that has absolutely nothing to do with God. So the root of sin was the illicit sexual relationship that the first human ancestors had with each other and with the archangel Lucifer. So Reverend Moon explained this way. When did Adam and Eve fall? It was during their teens. They were not old. Centering upon what did they fall? They fell centering on love, and two different kinds of love appeared. As a result of the illicit love relationship, evil seeds were sown throughout the world. So they could not multiply God's good, pure lineage, but instead they multiplied Satan's evil lineage. And this also explains why, as Christians, clearly understand that all human beings descending from Adam and Eve are born into sin, and they are in need of salvation. The fact that Adam and Eve's descendants are born with sin could not have been part of God's original plan and ideal. Instead, the sinful nature came about as a result of the fall, changing man's blood lineage from God's lineage to Satan's lineage. And this is the core of the reason why human beings need to be reborn. Why we have to be reborn? Because we have to change from being Satan's children to being God's children. And what is the meaning of heaven and hell in terms of the true nature of the fall? Now that we understand what the fall was, again, Reverend Moon here explains, now let us discover the dividing line between heaven and hell. Is it in midair? Where is it? It is none other than your sexual organ. This is a serious matter. This concept has turned heaven and earth upside down. Who can deny this? This is explained in the chapter, The Fall, in the Divine Principle, the teaching of Reverend Moon. If you doubt this, ask God. So although this understanding may be different than what we have heard in the past, it is important that we don't depend on any particular preacher that we've heard or some existing church ideology. So who really knows the truth? God knows, right? So for us to truly know the depth of God's word, we all need to pray and ask God himself. And as we know, if we ask God with a sincere heart, God will answer our prayers. So in summary, we can say that there is an eternal, unchanging principle that God created, which puts the God-centered family at the center of the kingdom. Think about it. In order to have a just and a flourishing and harmonious society, the God-centered family must remain intact. And we can certainly see that there is a huge challenge to this in our society today, in the world, right? To the God-centered family. It is being challenged on so many different levels. So God's kingdom begins with the fulfillment of the three blessings, one man and one woman. Yes, you can say man and woman, the two sexes, two genders. One man and one woman united with God's blessing, creating God's lineage on earth. Then to destroy God's kingdom, Satan attacked man's trust in God and then corrupted the standard of holy marriage through the misuse of love. So if we see, different ways that that religion is being attacked, or people's faith in God is being attacked, or God is being taken out of our schools and our society as a whole, and we see how the identity of men and women is being attacked, and marriage and family is being attacked, then we can really see evidence of the fall and Satan's work in society. So Satan replaced the God-centered love relationship between man and woman with a self-centered, fallen view of life, love, sex, and the marriage. So the love between a husband and a wife blessed in holy matrimony was meant to be where God's love would dwell. That's where we would experience the greatest joy and happiness. It's in the sexual relationship between man and woman, in the parental love between parents and children, and in the sibling love between brothers and sisters. The sexual parts of human beings were created by whom? Did Satan create our sexual parts? No, it was God. God created the sexual parts. Again, it was meant to be pure and guiltless. A sexual love between a true man, husband and wife, was meant to be a wonderful, God-centered part of life. It is only because Satan stole human love and sexuality through the fall that sex came to be perceived as dirty or shameful. This was the result of the fall. And in the next presentation, we will take even a closer look at the consequences of the fall. Thank you very much.